Hello everybody. This is our first kind of lesson this year that will actually be diving into a little bit of content. This year we're going to be dealing with a lot of charts and graphs and those kind of things algebraically so that you can see how the model of different functions will be working. And so things kind of that you've learned in Algebra 1 and possibly Algebra 2 if you've taken Algebra 2. And you'll be learning the different models and functions that deal with these different types of graphs. With this being said, though, is we're going to have to be learning how to graph things properly. Now, also, we're going to get to a point where graphing is too tedious, and we're going to have to use what's called a graphing calculator. Now, I am not full of money, and I don't have a bunch of graphing calculators to give everybody, but there is a free graphing calculator that we have online. There's a link in your Google Classroom that should take you right to the graphing calculator if you wanted it. And it is I think that it's probably even better because it even writes in color. We can download pictures. I think, and plus it's using the processing power of your phone, tablet, computer, whatever you have that you would be running it on, and it uses the processing power of that versus the processing power of a calculator. So I think that this is going to be a tool that is going to be very helpful for us. So with that being said, I'm going to be walking you through some of the things that we'll be doing this year. So let's start out by learning the different tools. So I'm going to get this centered up. I like to have one showing, so like if I zoom out far enough, you can see that 2 is our first point. I like to zoom out a little bit to where 1 is there. And my window doesn't really matter, but because we can zoom in and out however we please as we go. We don't have to actually create a window. So the first tool here is, it looks like a cursor that you would see on a computer with your mouse. Now what that does is it allows you to grab, pinch, open up, it allows you to click on things and move around, which is like your grabbing tool, which is going to be kind of confusing going back and forth because our next tool, I'll go ahead and go over, is a point placer. So it allows me to plot a point somewhere. So I'll plot a point here at 1, 1. And if you're not familiar, or if you need a refresher on coordinate planes or a coordinate system, the Cartesian system, we will be going over that in a future video, probably the next video that we actually go over as a review. But for right now, I'll just assume that you know it. I'm going to plot a point at 1, 1. We use this tool. Now notice that if I want to grab and zoom and stuff like this, whenever I click it, it's going to plot another point. So in order for me to grab, I'm going to have to go back to the cursor button in order to grab and move things around. But until then, we'll be able to use this. Now, with that being said, our next tool is a line. The line allows us to create different lines, line segments, rays, those kind of things that you learned about last year. So for example, I'll create a ray here, I'll plot a point here, and then I'll also click our point that we created earlier. So now I have a ray going from so forth. I'm going to go ahead and delete that because it's not going to have, we're not going to be using that often. Now we might a little bit, but just so that you know how to do it, but other than that. So the next one is parallel and perpendicular lines. So we'll actually be using that later, and I'll go over that later, but these will be the tools that we'll be using to create lines that are perpendicular and create lines that are parallel. That is a lesson that we will be going through in the next probably 4 weeks, but we'll get there. Creating polygons, we're not going to be dealing with many polygons this year. Circles, we'll probably be dealing with circles at the end of the year, but it won't be like circles that we did last year where you had where you're trying to find the circumference or trying to find the area or something like that. This year will be more trying to graph a circle using y's and x's. But so we won't probably using that tool, but it's nice to know. These are ellipses, hyperbolas. The next one's creating angles. Oh, slopes. So that'll be something that we'll be using possibly later on. And translations, which we did a little bit last year. And then these are little tools that we can use to like create a slider, push, make push buttons, which we'll talk about how to animate and stuff kind of later. All right, so first off, I'm going to get into what's called the degrees of algebra. So the law of degrees is a way of talking about what kind of function that you have. Like a linear function has a degree of 1. A quadratic function, although it sounds like you'd have a degree of 2 or 4, but it has a degree of 2, and then so forth. So they end up going over farther and farther. And we'll talk about the law of degrees later on, because this is a more of a GeoGebra style. But I'll start out by creating a function with the degree of 0. So when we create our functions, we'll get into function notation later, but for right now we're going to use y's because that's what you're familiar with. So we're going to set y equal to something. And I'm wanting it to go through that point that we just plotted a second ago. Now, what if I was just going to draw a line that goes through if I was going to just draw a line that goes to this point, I would probably pick either a vertical line or a horizontal line. But whenever we get into what a function is, which you probably know, a function can't go up and down. A function has to be horizontal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the function of y equals 1. And what happened, we got a horizontal line that went through the point 1, 1. Okay, let me delete that. See what I did? I didn't have it on the cursor. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a function with a degree of 1. So y equals 1 is a function of degree of 0, and then a function of degree of 1. So we're going to create a line that goes through the point 1, 1, but also has a degree of, it has a degree of 1. So how does that work? So we have y equals and then x. So it has a degree of 1. So we had to include a variable, so one variable, which we did have a variable for, but it was x to the 0th power. X to the 0th power is 1, and 1 times 1 is 1, so that's the reason why we got y equals 1. Or y times 1 to 1, y equals 1 times x to the 0th power. So this one, we have y equals x to the 1st power. So that's what happened here is we had a line. Now, notice that it has it in black. That can kind of get confusing after a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to settings, and I'm going to change the color of my line. I'm going to change it to red. So if you notice, right there, my line that I just drew changed to red. Okay, so now from here, this is kind of how algebra is set up. Whenever you took Algebra 1, you probably learned mostly lines, y equals mx plus b. If you took Algebra 2, you may not have, and maybe towards the end of Algebra 1, you learned about quadratics, which is a degree of 2. So that's what I'm going to write right now. So y equals, and then x, and now degree of 2. So we had x to the 0th power, x to the 1th power. Now it'll be x to the 2nd power. So notice our graph looks a little different. It still goes through the point 1, 1. And if you also notice, all these points go through the point 0, 0. But we'll get to that, why that is later. So that is a function of the degree of 2. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the color so that we don't get mixed up. Color, if someone was here, I'd have someone tell me a color, but for right now I'm just going to say blue. have to, there we go. All right, so from here, so we have a degree of 0, we have a degree of 1, and we have a degree of 2. Now we're going to do a degree of 3. You probably guessed it. What are we going to type? Y equals x to the, we have 0, 1, 2. This is going to be to the 3rd power. And we get this funky green shape here. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that you can see how it starts here. Now, something cool that I can do, let's say I just want to see the function to the degree of 3. So y equals x3. I can go over here and tap these little circles. Well, there we go. And that is now the only function that I see. It also only goes through the point, well, it goes through the 0.11. It doesn't only go through, it goes through infinitely many points, but it goes through the 0.11 as well as the other equations. So I'm going to go ahead and get the other functions back up, and I'm going to do a degree to 4. Y equals x to the, and then it'll be to the 4th power. Now, this is when it gets interesting. So I'm going to, it's so interesting that it's hard to see which line got added there. So I'm going to go ahead and take away the other equation so that all you have left is the degree of 4. So when you look at the graph, it looks just like the degree of 2. So I'll go ahead and pull the degree of 2 back up. I mean, it looks very similar. What makes it different is how flat it becomes and how quickly it rises. So it rises quicker, but it also starts out slower. So this is the similarity between degrees. So let's go ahead and go back to 5. Go ahead and put them all back on there. I'm going to have y equals x to the, I'm going to call it the 5th power. And here we go again. So I'm going to go ahead, hide all of the other degree functions. And on my left, I'm left with x to the 5th. And it looks awful similar to x to the 3rd. Now, let's try something. Let's add an x to both of these, because we can do that. We can add an x, we can add an x squared, we can add whatever we want, as long as that whatever we add does not have a higher degree than the initial point. It won't change to the degree of the equation. Okay, so I'm going to add an x. So let's plus x here and see what happens. Okay. So it got shorter. Notice that it also doesn't go through the 0.11. We'll go over why that is later. Let's add an x to the 3rd. X. Aha. See how similar these two are? I mean, if I was to hide one of them, I mean, it's hard to tell which one's which. It's like I almost forget which one's the x to the 5th and which one's the x to the 3rd. So the similarity in the degrees, this is important for us to understand whenever we're modeling algebraic functions. Now, we'll get into what it does whenever I add like an x to the 4th to a degree of 5, whenever I add an x to the 3rd to the degree of 4 or whatever. We'll get into what that means later on. But this video was to show you how fascinating the law of degrees actually is. And it also introduces you to GeoGebra. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. That's all I have for today. We'll have a review style video later on in the week, and then we'll have an assignment later on in the week too. I'm going to extend the due date from Monday to Wednesday of next week because I was so late getting the videos up. But that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your patience.